They said that summer came early to Strasbourg, but it was no season of warmth. It was a summer of ash and silence, where hunger clung to the air like a ghost that would not leave. The river, once clear as glass, now carried the color of old wounds. Its surface shone like tarnished brass beneath the weight of a swollen sun. The bells of the cathedral tolled each morning not for prayer, but for warning, a sound that trembled through the marrow of every man and woman, still pretending to believe in mercy. The city was tired, tired of prayers that yielded no bread, tired of saints that looked away. And in that exhaustion, something ancient began to stir, something that slept in the cracks of the cobblestones, something that remembered the rhythm of despair. Her name was Frau Trophäa, a widow, they said, a wife, a sinner, a shadow among the starving. No one remembers her voice, only the sound of her feet, bare against the stone, like the opening heartbeat of a dying city. At first it was nothing, a sway, a tremor, the smallest movement of flesh against heat. Then a step, then another. The kind of motion that belongs to no song, and yet demands to be followed. She danced, not for joy, not for celebration, but as if her body had been claimed by a memory too painful to keep still. People watched. They always do, when something breaks in front of them. A baker, his hands still white with flour. A mother clutching her child. A priest who tried to find God in the pattern of her movements and failed. They whispered that she was possessed. They whispered that she was blessed. And between those two whispers, a crowd was born. Her hair stuck to her skin. Sweat and blood mingled at her feet. Each step sounded like a plea, a rhythm pulled from the throat of heaven and thrown down to the stones. Some laughed, some crossed themselves. One child, too young to know fear, clapped his hands in time with her agony. And still she danced. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky like a slow blade. When her legs gave out, she fell. But even on her knees, the movement did not stop. Her shoulders jerked, her fingers clawed the air. Her eyes rolled like the eyes of an animal that refuses to die. Blood bloomed beneath her steps, dark and glistening, painting the stones with the color of deliverance. A priest knelt nearby, his lips moving soundlessly. Perhaps he prayed for her soul, perhaps for his own. For in that moment, every heart in the square felt the same question take root. What if this is not madness? What if this is revelation? By dusk, her body was a trembling candle, burning down to its final light. Her breath came ragged, her limbs spasmed, and for one heartbeat, she stopped. The crowd exhaled. The priest whispered, "Amen." The child began to cry. Then she rose slowly, awkwardly, like something that no longer belonged to the earth. Her spine straightened, her arms spread as if remembering wings. And though the last of the sunlight caught in her hair like fire, her face was a mask, empty, beautiful, and terrible. She looked up, not at the sky, but at something beyond it. And then she moved again. One step, two, a dance that no one could name. Some turned away, some fell to their knees. No one dared to stop her, for in the hollow between each movement, they felt it, a pulse that was not hers, a rhythm that came from somewhere deeper, older than bone or faith. When the final bell rang that night, the city of Strasbourg did not sleep. They watched her still, the woman who would not rest, the body that would not fall. And somewhere in the dark, as the wind carried her footsteps through the alleys, someone whispered, not in fear, but in awe, "She dances for us all." And thus began the plague, not of blood, nor pestilence, nor wrath, but of motion and music that no one could hear, and a hunger that no prayer could quench. A week passed, and the silence that once cloaked Strasbourg had learned to move. The square that had known stillness now pulsed like a living heart, a trembling, beating madness. It began with dozens, but numbers meant nothing. Each step echoed into the next, multiplying like fever, until the air itself began to shake. There was no music, yet there was rhythm. No drums, yet there was command. Something unseen had taken the city by the spine and taught it how to convulse. Men and women swayed as if caught in the tide of an invisible sea. Their faces, pale, glistening with sweat, mouths foaming like the mouths of the possessed. Their eyes had turned inward, and what they saw there no one could name. The cobblestones wept with blood where their feet had worn themselves raw. And still they moved. Merchants fled their stalls, leaving bread to rot in the heat. Windows slammed shut, prayers muttered through cracks. Even the rats avoided the square. A woman screamed when her husband stepped into the rhythm. He turned to her once and smiled. It was not joy nor sorrow. It was the expression of a man already halfway between the earth and whatever heaven had abandoned him. She ran to him, clawing at his arms, but his body was no longer his own. He moved with the grace of a marionette cut from its strings, jerking, spinning, twisting to the pulse that came from nowhere. His lips trembled as if whispering a prayer that had lost its words, and when his eyes met hers, they were filled with tears, not for her, not for himself, but for the terror of knowing that even in his agony, he could not stop. At the edge of the chaos, a monk watched, his robes dark with dust. He crossed himself once, twice, then whispered to the wind, "The devil walks among them, but he walks to a holy rhythm." Some heard him and nodded, for in the strangest way, it looked divine. A congregation without order, a prayer without language. From above, it was almost beautiful. Bodies moving in circles, arms rising, as if worshiping the sun that watched in silence. It looked like a ritual, like faith unhinged, but beauty is the cruelest disguise of horror. A man stumbled, one heartbeat too slow for the rhythm. His foot slipped on blood. He fell. The sound of his skull against the stone was loud enough to stop the birds. And yet, no one stopped dancing. His body lay there, twisted, a broken metronome among the still moving. A woman stepped over him, her heel pressing into his chest, her face serene, her hands still rising to a heaven that did not answer. Somewhere a priest began to sing, his voice thin, desperate, trying to find a hymn strong enough to drown the madness. But his song was swallowed by the rhythm, by the endless pounding of flesh against stone. The city was no longer praying, it was performing. And the performance had no audience, only witnesses. Children watched from doorways. Dogs howled until their throats gave out. And through it all, the sound, that terrible, relentless sound, of hundreds of feet striking the same unforgiving ground. No one knew where the rhythm came from. No one dared to ask. But if you stood in that square, if you closed your eyes and listened, you could feel it too. The pulse of something older than sin, beating through the bones of the dying city. And so they danced, through pain, through hunger, through death. Because to stop was to remember, and to remember was to suffer. Night fell heavy upon Strasbourg. The air in the council hall was thick, not with smoke, but with fear disguised as reason. Candles bled wax onto wooden tables, their flames trembling like guilty souls. The city's leaders gathered in a half-circle of authority, but beneath their robes and rings, they were merely men trying to name a monster they could not see. Theories poured like spilled wine, each one darker, more desperate than the last. "It is possession," said the bishop, eyes darting toward the crucifix. "It is poison," argued the merchant. "Something in the bread, something in the air." "No," whispered a judge. "It is punishment. For our greed, for our hunger, for our silence." The room shook with accusation. Blame leapt from tongue to tongue, like fire from candle to candle, and yet no light came of it. Then, a voice, fragile but certain, rose above the noise. It was the physician of Strasbourg, a man who still believed in the logic of the body, in fevers and fluids and balance. His eyes were tired, his faith not in heaven but in science, and yet his science sounded like heresy that night. "Let them dance," he said. "The body must expel the fever." A silence fell, thin and sharp as glass. The council listened, not because they understood, but because they wanted to believe, to cure madness with motion, to drown chaos with rhythm, to answer God's silence with music. And so it was decreed. Days later, the square filled again. This time not with fear, but with sound. Drums, flutes, violins, 1,000 notes climbing the walls of the city like vines of delirium. The musicians came at dawn, faces pale beneath the weight of their orders. They were told they were healers, midwives to a city's rebirth. But when they began to play, they became something else entirely. Priests of an unholy ritual. The dancers responded immediately. Their bodies convulsed, their limbs moved with unnatural grace, as if the music had found a home inside their bones. The sound grew louder. The drums no longer guided. They commanded. The violins screamed like angels tearing their own wings. And in that fevered rhythm, Strasbourg ceased to be a city. It became a heartbeat. Hundreds moved as one. Men and women, old and young, their feet slapping against stone in perfect monstrous unison. The air trembled with the violence of it. Each movement was a prayer shouted at the sky, a plea wrapped in rhythm. The camera would see what words cannot. A woman spinning, her hair tangled with blood, her belly swollen with life, her body twisting as if torn between birth and death. A priest clutching his crucifix so tightly that blood dripped from his palms, his eyes wet, not from faith, but from disbelief. And in the midst of it all, the physician stood watching, at first with pride, then with horror, as he realized his cure had no end. The music did not heal. It fed. Every note deepened the trance. Every beat carved new wounds into already broken flesh. What began as remedy became ritual. What was meant to save now consumed. And when the day sank into night, and still the dancing did not stop, the musicians' hands began to tremble. Their bows frayed, their drums tore, but they played on, because even they now could not stop. By the time the last candle in the council hall guttered out, the city had forgotten what silence was. And somewhere beneath the endless pulse of drums and the rustle of torn feet, a whisper echoed, a memory of reason already lost to the rhythm. Let them dance, he had said. The body must expel the fever. But the fever had become the body, and the cure had become the plague. Twilight fell like a bruise over Strasbourg, and the city, poor, fevered Strasbourg, burned, not with fire, but with motion. Every alley, every courtyard, every chapel was alive with the sound of skin against stone. The rhythm of salvation turned to sickness. There was no corner untouched. On the bridges, men danced with open mouths, gasping for air that would not come. In the courtyards, women spun until their veils tore from their hair. In the churches, even there, the faithful convulsed beneath the vaulted ceilings, their limbs striking pews like desperate prayers. Bodies filled the streets like water in a flood. A city no longer made of stone, but of flesh. A single organism trembling under one terrible command. Move. Some carried the dead in their arms, still twirling with the corpses as though refusing to see what they held. They smiled into lifeless faces, whispering love to mouths that no longer answered. And still the dance went on. The priests came then, their robes dragging through blood, their voices low and hoarse. They walked among the dying with crucifixes raised, their Latin chants cutting through the chaos like brittle reeds. Sancta Vitus, ora pro nobis. Saint Vitus, pray for us. But their prayers were swallowed before they reached the sky. The rhythm devoured everything, even the sound of faith. It was said that the saints turned their faces away that night, that heaven, unable to bear the sight, closed its eyes. Children watched from doorways. At first they cried, then they began to imitate, their small bodies mimicking the shuddering of the dying, their laughter piercing through the screams like a cruel echo. For them, it was play, a game of rhythm, of mimicry. They did not know it was death they were pretending. A little boy, no older than 6, pulled at his mother's sleeve. His eyes were wide, reflecting the fires that flickered from torches and fevered flesh. "Mother," he asked, "why won't they stop?" The woman did not answer at first. Her lips trembled, her gaze fixed on the crowd that moved like waves of the damned. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper, as though afraid that even her words might join the rhythm. "Because God is watching," she said, "and they cannot look away." The boy did not understand. How could he? He only knew that the sound never stopped. The endless thudding of feet, the gasps, the screams that came like music. Above it all, the church bells began to ring. Once they had meant salvation. Now they were only metronomes for the madness, the tolling heartbeat of a dying city. The priests continued their chanting, their words dissolving into the roar of the possessed. Their faith, once solid, now cracked under the rhythm's weight. They no longer believed in redemption, only in endurance. And when night came, the city glowed not with the light of heaven, but with the fever of hell, torches flickering against walls streaked with blood and sweat. In that light, everything blurred, the holy and the damned, the living and the dead, the dancers and the mourners. They were all one, a single trembling body beneath a God who did not answer. The rhythm carried through the streets like a wind that could not be stopped. Feet moved even after the souls inside them had gone still. The bells tolled again, slow, steady, merciless. And in that sound was the truth no one dared speak. This was no longer a plague. It was a prayer that had forgotten its words, a faith that had devoured itself. Strasbourg had become a cathedral of motion, and every step, every scream, was an offering to a God who was watching and yet would not look away. Morning came, but no one saw it. The sun rose over Strasbourg as if nothing had happened, as if the earth itself had chosen to forget. But the city remembered. The stones remembered. They were slick with blood and prayer, and beneath them, the rhythm still slept, faint and waiting. The square was still, so still that even the wind seemed afraid to move. Where there had once been music, there was only the whisper of flies. They floated lazily above the bodies, dancing in a silence more sacred than any hymn. Hundreds lay where they had fallen, frozen mid-step, mid-spin, mid-prayer. Faces tilted toward heaven, hands still reaching for something that had never reached back. The dance had ended, but it had not stopped. It lived now in the stillness, in the strange peace that comes only when every sound has been spent. The air was heavy with iron and incense, the scent of the church and the grave, of devotion and decay. No one spoke. There were no witnesses left, only the dead and the silence that claimed them. Through that silence moved a single figure, a priest old and trembling, his robe torn, his eyes hollowed by the weight of what he had seen. He walked between the bodies like one walking through a dream, his sandals brushing against the skirts of the dead. He did not cry. Tears belonged to the living, and he was no longer certain he was among them. When he reached the center of the square, he stopped. Before him lay Frau Trophäa, the woman who had begun it all, the first to dance, the first to fall. She was lying on her back, her body curved as though still caught in motion. Her eyes were open, staring not at heaven, but at something far beyond it, and on her lips rested the faintest trace of a smile, not of peace, but of release. The priest knelt beside her, his knees cracked against the stone, and for a long moment he said nothing. Around him the city waited, its streets filled with silence so deep it seemed alive. Finally he spoke, not loudly, not as a sermon, but as a confession. "We prayed for a sign of his mercy," he whispered, and he answered, "but we were not strong enough to look." The words fell into the air and vanished, swallowed by the stillness that had replaced the world. He lowered his head and closed her eyes with trembling fingers. Her skin was cold, but soft, as if the fever had not taken her, but merely carried her somewhere else. The priest looked up then, to the sky that had burned and now stood blameless again. He wondered if God had ever watched at all, or if this had been their doing from the start. A city dancing to its own destruction, calling it worship. The bells hung silent in the tower. The smoke had thinned. The birds, cautious, began to return. And still, in that unbearable calm, there was the faint echo of something. A heartbeat, a memory, a rhythm that refused to die. He rose slowly, his body bent beneath the weight of unanswered prayers. Around him lay the congregation he had never meant to keep. Saints, sinners, mothers, children. All equal now, all still. The dance was over, but its shadow remained, etched into the cobblestones, into the air, into the silence itself. And as the priest walked away, his footsteps joined that silence. A new rhythm beginning, soft and sorrowful, marking the end of mercy and the beginning of remembrance. Dusk came gently to Strasbourg, as if the sky itself pitied what remained. Smoke drifted above the rooftops, not the thick black kind that devours, but the pale ghost of what once burned. A final sigh from a city that had forgotten how to breathe. The air was strangely beautiful, too still, too kind, as though the world, ashamed of what it had witnessed, was trying to cover it with silence. The square lay empty, a grave without tombstones, a stage without audience. The stones still bore the stains of the dance, dark circular marks where flesh had turned to rhythm, where life had been spent in motion until motion became death. The church doors creaked, and from their shadow stepped a boy, small, barefoot, his face gray with dust and the faint memory of tears. He looked around, and for the first time in many days there was no sound, no screaming, no singing, only the echo of quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in the bones, the kind that feels like waiting. The boy took a hesitant step forward. The ground crunched softly beneath him. He passed the bodies, men, women, the old, the young, frozen mid-motion, their faces serene and ruined all at once. He did not flinch. Children do not yet know what should terrify them. To him, this was not horror. It was aftermath. He tilted his head. Something in the air, not a song, not quite a voice, a whisper shaped like music. It came from nowhere, and yet it called to him like memory. His eyes softened. He listened. And then slowly, his small hand lifted. His foot followed. One step, two, the faintest echo of the rhythm that had consumed them all. No one was there to stop him. No one to pray, no one to shout. Only the ghosts of the city, watching from the corners where the light no longer reached. He moved gently, as if testing the air for permission. The smoke curled around him, and in its shape, for an instant, the city seemed to move again. From the cathedral tower came the bells. They rang once, slow, hollow, final. Then again, and again. Their sound rolled across the square like thunder muffled by ash. Once those bells had meant salvation. Now they were simply rhythm. And the boy, the last living rhythm of Strasbourg, danced to it. His body swayed with the grace of innocence, not yet knowing the weight of what it echoed. The setting sun caught his silhouette and stretched it long across the stones, a shadow that moved as though the city itself were dancing again, through him. He smiled just faintly, the same weary smile Frau Trofea had worn when she fell. The same surrender, the same peace. The bells continued. Their sound grew softer, slower, until each toll became a heartbeat fading into dusk. And over it, the voice of the narrator, quiet, reverent, like the voice of history whispering to those who never listen. In the summer of 1518, Strasbourg danced itself to death. No enemy, no plague, no sword, only faith and fear and the rhythm between them. The camera lingers on the boy, still moving, still listening to the silence that hums beneath the world. Then the light fades, the smoke rises, and the square, once alive, once damned, becomes still again. Only the faint echo of footsteps remains, softer now, fading into eternity. A city that prayed for mercy had been answered, but mercy had worn the face of madness. And as night claimed the last light of Strasbourg, the rhythm, ancient, patient, and merciless, waited for the next heart strong enough to hear it.